Hello students, today I am going to discuss with you lesson number 2 titled The Portrait of a Lady, written by the famous writer Khushwant Singh. First of all, I would like to discuss with you a brief biography of the writer. Khushwant Singh has written a number of books on Sikh history and religion. He has also translated a number of books from Urdu and Punjabi into English. Apart from being a writer, he has been a lawyer, a public relation officer, and the editor of the Illustrated Weekly of India. Two of his well known novels are Train to Pakistan and I Shall Not Hear the Nightingale. So, this was the brief biography of the writer Khushwant Singh. Let's now discuss the brief summary or the intro of the lesson, The Portrait of a Lady. This is a real story of the writer's grandmother, who was an old woman. The writer in this lesson tells us the story of his childhood that he had spent with his grandmother. So, let us now discuss the text of the lesson. My grandmother, like everybody's grandmother, was an old woman. She had been old and wrinkled for the 20 years that I had known her. In this paragraph of the lesson, the writer shares with us his past memories, which he has, the past memories of the times which he has spent with his grandmother. He gives us a description of his grandmother, that she was an old woman. She was, her face was full of so many wrinkles, and she was same for the 20 years that I had known her. People said that she had once been young and pretty and even had a husband. He comes to know about his grandmother, that she was once a very young woman and she was very beautiful, and even she had a husband at that time. But that was hard to believe. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. In this paragraph, in these lines, the writer tells us about his grandfather, that when the people used to tell him about his grandfather, it was very difficult for him to believe that his grandmother once had even had a husband. My grandfather's portrait hung above the mantelpiece in the drawing room. He wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. His long white beard covered the best part of his chest, and he looked at least 100 years. He tells us about his grandfather that he wore a big turban and loose-fitting clothes. He had a very long and white colored beard that covered the best part of his chest, and by looks or by appearance he looked at least 100 years old. He did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children, but by his looks he did not look the sort of person who would have a wife or children, because he was very old by his looks. He looked as if he could only have lots and lots of grandchildren. As for my grandmother being young and pretty, the thought was almost revolting. Revolting here means shocking. When people tell him about his grandmother, about being her young and pretty, this thought was almost shocking for him. She often told us of the games she used to play as a child. That seemed quite absurd and undignified on her part, and we treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. The writer tells us in these lines that whenever his grandmother uh, used to tell them about the games which she played during her childhood, all these things seemed to him quite absurd, means funny, or all these things were funny for him to believe. We treated it like the fables of the prophets she used to tell us. Fables means stories uh, told by or preached by the prophets. Prophets here means the religious preachers. She had always been short and fat and slightly bent. Her face was crisscross of wrinkles, running from everywhere to everywhere. No, we were certain she had always been as we had known her. She had always been short. In this paragraph, the writer is telling us about the physique of his grandmother, that she was short, fat, and slightly bent because of her old age. There were so many wrinkles on her face which run from everywhere to everywhere. We were certain she had always been as we had known her, old, so terribly old that she could not have grown older, and had stayed at the same age for 20 years. The writer says that his grandmother looked same for the last 20 years. She could never have been pretty, but she was always beautiful. She hobbled about the house in spotless white, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stove, and the other telling the beads of her rosary. She hobbled. Hobbled here means she walked in an uneven manner in the house in her spotless white clothes, with one hand resting on her waist to balance her stoop, and then with the other hand she used to tell the beads of her rosary. Means she was a very religious minded woman who used to pray each and every time. Her silver locks were scattered untidily over her pale, puckered face, and her lips constantly moved in inaudible prayer. She was very religious minded, so her lips constantly moved in an inaudible prayer. Inaudible here means voice which cannot be heard. Yes, she was beautiful. She was like the winter landscape in the mountains, an expanse of pure white serenity, breathing peace and contentment. The writer says that his grandmother was an epitome of purity, peace, and contentment. Contentment means satisfaction. She was always she always looked satisfied with everything in her life. My grandmother and I were good friends. My parents left me with her when they went to live in the city, and we were constantly together. When the parents of the writer Khushwant Singh went to city to settle there, he spent a lot of time with his grandmother in the village. She used to wake me up in the morning and get me ready for school. She said her morning prayer in a monotonous sing song while she bathed and dressed me in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. When his parents went to city to settle there, his grandmother used to wake him up in the morning, then get him ready for school, And while doing all these tasks, she used to say prayers in a very low voice, in the hope that I would listen and get to know it by heart. She expected it from the writer Khushwant Singh that he would listen the prayers which she used to pray, which she used to uh, say in the low voice, but he never tried to learn it by his heart. I listened because I loved her voice but never bothered to learn it. Then she would fetch my wooden slate, which she had already washed and plastered with yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot, and a reed pen, tie them all in a bundle, and hand it to me. Then she would fetch. Fetch here means bring. Then she would bring his wooden slate for him, which she had already washed and plastered with the yellow chalk, a tiny earthen ink pot. Tiny here means very small. Earthen ink pot and a reed pen. Tie them with those all things in a bundle and hand it to the writer. After a breakfast of a thick stale chapati with a little butter and sugar spread on it, we went to the school. After having their breakfast with the chapatis, stale chapatis, and butter and sugar spread on it, then they went to school. She carried several stale chapatis with her for the village dogs, and while going to school with him, his grandmother used to take some several stale chapatis for the village dogs. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The priest taught us the alphabet and the morning prayer, while the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda singing the alphabet or the prayer in a chorus. My grandmother sat inside reading the scriptures. My grandmother always went to school with me because the school was attached to the temple. The writer here tells us that his grandmother always used to go with him to his school because school and the temple attached to both were attached. The priest taught us the alphabets. When the priest used to teach them the alphabets and the morning prayer, and the children sat in rows on either side of the veranda. On the same time, the grandmother used to sit in the temple and read the scriptures. Scriptures here means religious books. When we had both finished, we would walk back together. This time, the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. They followed us to our home, growling and fighting with each other for chapatis that we threw to them. When we had both finished, when both the writer and his grandmother both finished their school timing, and grandmother finished her prayers in the temple, uh, then they both walked back together. This time the village dogs would meet us at the temple door. This time the village dogs used to meet them at the temple door, and the his grandmother used to throw the chapatis which she carried with her for the village dogs. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, they sent for us. That was a turning point in our friendship. Although we shared the same room, the grandmother no longer came to school with me. I used to go to English school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she used to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our house. When my parents were comfortably settled in the city, the writer in this paragraph tells us that when his parents settled comfortably in the city, they sent for us. Sent for means they called the writer and his grandmother too in the city to live with them. That was a turning point in the friendship of the writer and his grandmother. Although in the city too they shared the same room, but his grandmother no longer came with him to his school. I used to go to an English school in a motor bus because now he used to go to his school in a motor bus. There were no dogs in the streets, and she took to feeding sparrows in the courtyard of our city house. In the city there were no street dogs, so uh, she used to feed sparrows in the courtyard of their city house. As years rolled by, we saw less of each other. For some time she continued to wake me up and get me ready for school when they uh, went to live in the city with his parents. The time passed on, but they saw each other for a very less time. For some time, she continued to wake him up and get him ready for school. When I came back, she would ask me what the teacher had taught me. I would tell her English words and little things of Western science and learning. When he used to come back from his school, his grandmother would ask him about the studies in his English school. He would tell her about the English words and the little things of Western science and learning, the law of gravity, Archimedes' principle, the world being round, etc. This made her unhappy. By hearing all these things from his grandson, she used to become unhappy. Unhappy means sad. She could not help me with my lessons because he was now studying in an English medium school. She did not believe in the things they taught at the English school and was distressed that there was no teaching about God and the scriptures. She was unhappy. She was distressed. Distressed means she was unhappy at the fact that the students were not being given any religious education in the English school. One day I announced that we were being given music lessons. She was very disturbed. To her, music had lewd associations. One day, the writer Khushwant Singh declared at his home that the students of his class are going to be given music lessons in his school. She got very disturbed, very unhappy at the fact. To her, music had lewd associations because for her, music means something indecent, and so she didn't like the music. So this was our today's discussion of first and second page of lesson number 2, the portrait of a lady. Thank you very much.